What's up, guys, and welcome to probably or maybe one of your most important basic fundamentals of training video, and that is the fundamentals of muscle. That's why we're here. We're here to train muscle. And so what I want to do with this video is get you closer to getting away from working out. We want to get away from that. We want to get away from doing exercises. And we want to get closer to actually training. And if we're training, the major difference when we're training as opposed to working out is we're not doing exercises, we're doing contractions. The way that I like to explain this is that training is like a backdoor approach to working out. Working out, we hold whatever application we are using, like a row or a machine or a chest press. You know, they're all labeled with a body part: chest press, lat row, and we're using that application and we're holding it responsible for actually developing that tissue. The reality is, when you train, you're actually saying to yourself, what do I want to specifically do with a muscle from a function standpoint? And based off of that function, that specific function, what application serves to produce that environment where I can make that contraction. Hopefully that makes sense. It's very much so a backdoor approach, right? Most people think I have this application and it makes this contraction and this function automatically. And it's not always that. And the reason why is because you are one of one. You are only you. There is nobody else like you. Nobody else is built like you. Nobody else moves like you. Nobody else has the same insertions and origins that you do. Nobody else has the same current settings that you do, meaning training experience, efficiency, neurological efficiency, things of that nature. So for you to compare yourself to your brother Bob, your sister Jane, or your training partner Bill would be a bad idea, because you are unique. So we need to have a very good idea and understanding of muscle anatomy, which we're going to get to in phase 3. But we also need to understand what's happening with muscle when we train. So when we go in and we train, we're trying to do this major thing with muscle. Trying to contract in an isolated environment, which means that we're trying to usually just bias one muscle group working on an exercise application. So if I'm doing a bicep curl, I want the majority of tension to be produced. I want the majority of that resistance to be going through the bicep. I don't want it to be going through my forearm. I don't want it to be going through my hand. I don't want it to be going through my front delt or my clavicular part of my pecs. I want it to be in my bicep. Okay, so again, having an understanding of function is very important to that. But what's happening in the contraction, all right, as scientific as I'm going to make it, is we have this thing called actin and myosin cross bridging. That's the process by which a muscle is actually shortening, okay? Cross bridging makes this muscle shorten, and then the bridge gets broken when it goes lengthened. And essentially, actin and myosin cross bridging makes up these things called sarcomeres. And some of you guys out there might go, I don't care about this. I'm just trying to give you guys context to what makes up a muscle. So all these layers of sarcomeres is what makes up a muscle. So your muscle's comprised of hundreds, thousands, millions, I don't know, but plenty of sarcomeres that make up your biceps, all right? And what's important to know is when you're going through a shortening and lengthening of a muscle with extremes amount of tension going through it, you're requiring your body to make this actin and myosin cross bridging, but you're also damaging those sarcomeres. So contracting a muscle is very inflammatory. And off of that inflammatory response comes a signaling for protein synthesis. And off of that protein synthesis, if your nutrition's in a point to recover and rebuild, that's where new sarcomeres are made. It's where new muscle tissue is made. Protein synthesis makes stronger, thicker sarcomeres, and that's what we're looking for, right? That's about as specific as I want to get. Did I explain everything when it comes to what happens in a contraction from a physiological stance? No, but you're not here for science class, and I'm not the science guy. I just want to give you context to what happens with a muscle when it contracts. Now let's start to go up to the surface. We were looking at stuff underneath. Start to go to some of the things that we can see. Let's continue to use the bicep as an example. So let's say this is the shoulder joint. This is my really thick bicep. This is the elbow joint. This is my forearm. And this is my hand. Okay? Let's make this guy just a little bit bigger. So this elbow, shoulder, right? These are all the muscle fibers here of the bicep. We're talking directly about the bicep. You need to understand like some of the terminology of muscle. Every muscle has at its beginning, where it starts, a thing called an origin. And what that means to you is it is the unmoving part of the muscle, okay? It is sometimes a very broad contact, meaning like it covers a long surface area. The origin is, an example of that is the chest. Sternal part of the chest. I look at my chest here. Here's part of that origin. Here's part of that origin. Here, here, and here. The biceps aren't exactly the same. The biceps, say like this is my scapula. Okay, they attach to a very small part of the scapula. So their origin doesn't have a large surface area. But essentially what origin means to you is it is the start of the muscle. The second part of a muscle that you need to know is the insertion. And so the insertion is the end of the muscle. Pretty simple, right? And what happens in a contraction when a muscle is shortening, when it's going through actin and myosin cross bridging, is that that muscle is pulling. This is my insertion and this is my origin. That muscle is pulling the insertion toward the origin in the direction that those muscle fibers actually go. Sorry guys, I have an itch on my foot. Not just like posing sexy for you. Even though if that works for you, it works for you. Okay? So the insertion is always pulling in the direction of those muscle fibers toward the origin. Things can start to get a little bit confusing if you're talking about a muscle that has multiple lines of pull as far as the muscle fibers go. One is the chest, another one is the back, another one is the quads, another one is the hamstrings. The quads and the hamstrings have several muscle groups that pull in kind of different-ish directions. The chest has a large, broad contact of origin, which has multiple lines of pulling. And the back is the same, multiple lines of pull because it has a broad contact of origin. So go into your like anatomy books and just look at kind of where those muscles start and where they finish. What else is important about knowing the origin and insertion besides the fact that the insertion is moving toward the origin as the muscle shortens? The other thing that is pretty stinking important, I'm grabbing my markers here, is that whatever joints that muscle crosses, it has action on. Let's keep going to our bicep example here. Our biceps attach to the scapula, which means that our bicep actually crosses the shoulder joint, okay? And the biceps actually go across, say like this was my pinky right here. Biceps actually go across and they attach to the radius here, which is on the pinky side of the hand. So they cross the elbow joint too. That means that the biceps cross two joints. Well, because it crosses two joints, it has two primary functions that are important to you. It can flex the shoulder and it can flex the elbow. So it can have action on those simultaneously or independent. When we train, oftentimes when we're trying to negate as much tension into we're trying to dictate as much tension as we possibly can into a working muscle. We oftentimes want to isolate to one function at a time. So let's take a bicep curl example like a preacher curl. I'm kind of in this position. I have my shoulder in a fixed position while I'm exercising the elbow flexing action. All right, I know my bicep can do this and this at the same time, but I isolate it to just that elbow flexing action because it allows me to produce more internal tension. Okay? Is that making sense to you guys? Hopefully it is. I just said the word tension, and that's drawing me into the next part of this. Tension. Tension, the way that I'm going to describe it to you guys is the intensity. It's like a measure of intensity inside a contracted muscle. Okay? So when you are training, the reason why we are in this pursuit to get stronger is because resistance, sorry guys, my marker is burning out. Resistance can help apply to that intensity. However, resistance has to be earned. It's not that I'm saying that I'm an advocate of lightweight, but in order for me to be progressive in my resistance, there's other things that have to be put in place. Number one, I need to know the purpose of the exercise application because I made a choice based off of the specific contraction I'm trying to get out of that working muscle. Number two, I've taken the time to fit my structure into that application. Going back to that preacher curl example, not everybody fits a preacher curl really well with both arms. For me to fit a preacher curl, like I really have to jam myself up in line with the way that guy hinges with both arms. It's very, very challenging for me. If I load that too quickly without working on setup things, I'm not going to be putting as much tension into that working muscle that I think, and so progress is going to be pretty relatively slow. Okay, so resistance, load, dumbbell weight, bar weight, all that stuff that we like to really become obsessive with is only another opportunity or tool to increase this tension. And that is the name of the game of muscle, guys. When we go into the gym, we are trying to produce as much tension between 2 points. Do you know what those 2 points are? Origin and insertion. You guessed that. Okay? My little towel here. Last thing I want to talk about is just some lingo. So we have a muscle, and we say that muscle is fully shortened. It's important here, again, my reminder and my hint and my wink to you guys is you're not going to be able to like figure these out for yourself on your own without knowing about muscular anatomy. Where does the origin start? Where does the insertion finish for that working muscle? When a muscle is fully shortened, it means that it absolutely cannot contract anymore. It couldn't get any more contracted. The example of the biceps would be all the way shoulder flex without the shoulders elevating. That's about it. And all the way here and all the way supinated. That is a fully shortened bicep for me. It's a very sensitive contraction. Okay, when you are in a fully shortened position, if you're having a hard time finding a working muscle, sorry, this is the place to find it. In the fully shortened position, it is always going to be the most sensitive range of motion for that working muscle. It's where there's the most like internal pressure happening. The most things are squeezing together. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that. Okay. Also in the fully shortened position, this is where you're going to be, if you can read that, you're going to be most weak there. So if somebody came in and applied resistance in this direction when I'm here, they're going to be able to pull my hand away and my lower arm away from my upper arm pretty relatively easy as opposed to if it were here. Okay. If I say I'm training in the shortened range, that doesn't necessarily mean fully shortened, okay? So we have the lengthened range for the bicep, the middle range, and then everything beyond that is shortened, 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 shortened. We can also refer to the shortened range as just being the shortened range of a specific function. So since the biceps have 2 primary functions, I could just be talking about elbow flexing. So I'm just working the shortened range of elbow flexion here, right? Not all the way to the mid, not all the way to the lengthen, just that shortened range. And so I could be training here, but just working that shortened range here. All right, hopefully that makes sense. There's a very minute difference between training the shortened range and training the fully shortened range, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, you should be able to figure this one out since I explained the first two of the shortened part. If I say something is fully lengthened, that means both functions are in their completely stretched position. So that's the big deal, stretched. I'm going to make a note here because this is a good reminder for me to get into something at the end of the video for you guys. Fully lengthened means all the way in the stretched position, okay? So again, function is important. The bicep example would be not shoulder flexion, not elbow flexion, but the opposite. Depressed, shoulder extension, and elbow extension. That's my fully lengthened bicep, okay? My fully lengthened bicep is also my fully shortened antagonist, which opposite muscle, supporting muscle. In this case, the antagonist is the tricep. So I can really feel my tricep here being fully contracted while my bicep is being fully lengthened. Pretty cool, right? Human body's pretty sweet, all right? So if I'm working in the lengthened range, it's the same deal. I could be working solely in that lengthened part of that range of motion, and that could go through every degree of shoulder flexion. This is the lengthened range, and this also is the lengthened range. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be in a fully lengthened bicep, okay? You guys following me? You guys still with me? We're getting pretty close. So there's two ranges of motion to every single contraction. Every single contraction, remember, has maximal tension. You're producing as much internal tension as you possibly can. If I say the term concentric, okay, what that means is that the muscle is shortening. It's getting shorter, okay? This is the concentric range of motion. If I say eccentric, that means that the muscle is lengthening, all right? Which one are you going to be stronger in? You're always going to be stronger in the eccentric range of motion. Think of like your bench presses that you've taken to failure. I know all you bros out there have done that at some point in your life, just like I did when I first got started. You were always able to control the eccentric, but there was always at the end of the set some time when you got buried by that bar and just couldn't start that concentric part of the range of motion. So I've seen statistics that oftentimes say that you're upwards of 40% stronger than eccentric. I don't really care about that. You can get it by feel, but you're always going to have more gas left in the tank through the eccentric, which is why some advanced training principles, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's okay to foreshadow things. Some advanced training principles like forced eccentrics are a good idea, like when you're trying to break through the plateau of trying to produce more effort and more tension at a working load that you just have had for quite some time. Okay, going back into here, also from a coordination standpoint, if I'm having a hard time coordinating a movement, controlling a movement, having like management of a movement, I will always coordinate if I put more time into the eccentric. So speaking from a tempo standpoint, if I have a hard time managing my squat, if I slow the eccentric down, especially when I'm tired, I'm setting myself up for a more successful and isolated concentric, okay? So in my opinion and with my experience, if you put a lot of emphasis on the eccentric part of the range of motion here, really mastering that part from shortened range of motion to lengthened range of motion, which means shortened muscle to lengthened muscle, whatever range you're training that muscle in, if you put your emphasis into that, you're going to make your life of having a successful concentric much, much better. And for those of you people that are taking your sets to complete muscular failure, again, for example, in the bicep curl, the one constant that's always there is tension. The intensity of that tension never leaves. The only thing that changes is how far I can continue to shorten that muscle as fatigue sets in, okay? So what's happening in the eccentric and what's happening in the concentric as it pertains to you? Like what's happening to that muscle? Well, if the tension and the load is there, in the eccentric, the stretching part of the range of motion, we're having muscular breakdown or damage. This is the name of the game, guys, in hypertrophy training. We want that muscular breakdown. So if you want to beat your muscle tissue up and create that inflammatory response of broken tissue, master those eccentrics. What's happening in the concentric range of motion? Okay, you're getting a buildup of byproducts and lactic acid. So if you're a person that says, man, I like to go in the gym and have a massive, massive pump, well, then you better be squeezing that concentric range of motion as hard as you can with every single cell in your body. The harder you do, the more intensity that you do, the more that you're requiring a higher percentage of these muscle fibers, whether it's high or low threshold muscle fibers. Don't worry about those right now. The more you're going to build up these byproducts and feel that lactic acid, that's going to put that blood supply, water supply, all those good things, they're going to accumulate and give you that massive balloon effect pump to where you feel like you're really big, and you look in the mirror and you go, wow, I'm not that big at all. But feeling like it is half of the battle, okay? So that is a little bit of our overview of muscle, guys. Hopefully I've given you some clarity on why muscle is important, what this whole muscle game is all about, and some of the terminology that goes into going away from exercising and working out and actually going into training a specific muscle group. From insertion to origin to understanding concentric and eccentric, it's all very, very important. The last note that I want to make is there is a difference, again, between a muscle that's actually going to be able to function for you, a muscle that can actually create a contraction against resistance or produce internal tension, and a muscle that cannot. And this goes again into having a concept about muscular function so that you have an idea between what we call active and passive range of motion, okay? So if I'm talking about my active range of motion, this is going to be the place where my muscle can contract. As it pertains to you, I can produce force here. And force means tension. Tension is what we want. We always want tension. So when my muscle's active, I can produce tension. Now, what I want to do is give you an example again with the bicep. My active lengthened bicep, fully lengthened bicep, would be shoulder and scapula depressed and braced, okay? All right, elbow extended, arm pronated, and shoulder extended. That's as far as I can go. That is how far I can actively lengthen my bicep. Like I feel my bicep is stretched and I feel my tricep is contracting. Something internally is happening with tension. A contraction is happening. We have this other thing called passive. Okay? And passive essentially means no tension or very little. And this is where my structure, not my muscle, my structure can go to. Oftentimes, this is a destination. And when we're talking about training muscle, we are never those people going for a certain destination. We're going for a range of motion with tension. Going back to that bicep example, if I'm here, depressed, extended in both joints, pronated, that's as far as I can actively go. Can I go farther? Yep, I can go a lot farther. But what happens? I can't feel my biceps anymore. My shoulders actually moved. So what I'm doing is I'm actually taking that joint through a greater degree of range of motion. But the argument would be, well, isn't that a more lengthened bicep? Yes, it is a more lengthened bicep. But is it a more lengthened bicep with tension? And the answer to that probably is no. In my opinion, the difference between active and passive range of motion is you learning how to brace. When you learn how to brace your inside, your outside automatically learns how to create tension. As soon as you lose your bracing and your stability, you automatically, when you fatigue, drift from active into passive, especially when you're working with resistance, because resistance will pull you into whatever range of motion it can, because that's what it does. It's got to fall back to where it started. And you need to make sure that whatever's happening with that resistance It's always happening within the endpoints of that origin and insertion, actually actively pulling toward each other or lengthening actively away from each other, okay? So when we train, active range of motion is very, very important. And when we're not training, passive range of motion is okay for your body to discover, like, oh, I can move my joints here and be safe. And the reality is, as your muscles start to become stronger, as they start to get better in these end ranges, these extremes, and I didn't talk about that, but an extreme range of motion is fully lengthened or fully shortened. Those are our extremes. As they become stronger actively in those extremes, they're going to be able to get closer and closer to that end passive range for that joint, because your body goes, hey, it's safe for me to go here and produce tension and have resistance, so I can actually make some output here. So what you're going to find is, if you're a person that is not very flexible, the better you are at producing force within a muscle, and the more that you exercise that in the extremes, the more flexibility you'll get, because those joints will start to open up and you won't be so rigid. Okay, so that is a little bit of an overview, guys, about muscle. We can make this super, super complex. I tried to simplify it for you so that you can apply it to the gym. But the context of everything you do in the gym has to start basically with a whiteboard session. So you can go, okay, I understand that. And I also have an idea now of what I'm trying to apply over the gym. And all I want you guys to do is to understand that what I'm trying to apply is, what does a fully lengthened position feel like? What's a fully shortened position feel like? What's a good concentric feel like? What's a good eccentric feel like? And what's it feel like to have maximal tension throughout the entirety of the set? If you start to get that down, well, then you've taken a giant step forward with the fundamentals of muscle. And I appreciate you for that. Thanks for tuning in.